And in this session, we are going to be exploring Gaelic Ireland as it was in the 12th century. So, we've done our initial introduction into early Ireland and we would have spoken about the Viking invasion. But let's explore in a little bit more detail the composition of Gaelic Ireland. And we're going to start off by discussing the various kingdoms that made up Gaelic Ireland. And we're also going to be talking about something called the Tanistry System. Now, I really want you to take note of the Tanistry System because this is going to be really important, not just in this particular course where we talk about the Norman invasion, but it'll also come back into play when we talk about the Tudor conquest of Ireland and something called surrender and regrant. But returning our attention to the 12th century, Gaelic Ireland consisted of approximately 100 to 150 minor kingdoms or tua, and each one was governed by a chief or king. The head of each family had a title. So for instance, the O'Neill family, the head of that clan was called the O'Neill. And across Gaelic Ireland, the system of tanistry, which I mentioned, was used to determine a kingship or chieftaincy of a family. This meant that any male relative descended from a common great-grandfather, that's great-grandfather, which would be collectively known as a Durban, could declare themselves as potential leader of the clan. And a democratic vote would be made amongst the members of the Durban to elect an heir or Taoiseach to the current leader. So this would mean that once the current leader would pass on or retire, which they could sometimes do, the strongest candidate would then be in a position to take over the clan. And a lot of people heralded this as an example of how great and enlightened Gaelic Ireland actually was. And in fairness, there is some merit to the idea of a democratic vote to determine the next leader. But in practice, this is going to mean that many male members of a clan will see each other as rivals, particularly brothers, and blinding, maiming, and even outright murder was quite common amongst many Gaelic families to ensure that rivals to either Taoiseach or a head of the clan were taken care of. Gaelic society was made up of a number of different groups. The Ishtana were the learned class, and that includes the Bretons, who were the professional judges, and I might do a separate class on the Breton laws because they're so big. Then we had the Fili, who were the poets and historians who passed on stories from history. Then we had the Fla, which were the nobles, they held land and political authority. The Boru were land-owning farmers. Then we had Cayley, which were tenant farmers, and then Bohawk, which were labourers. So, we have all of these different groups and different elements of Gaelic society. So it wasn't just one large group, it was actually much more complex than that. When it came to Gaelic military, there wasn't a standing army as such, but there was regular combat and fighting amongst Gaelic clans. Warfare and raiding were quite regular, but as I said, no permanent armies. The nobles would become a form of light cavalry, but they never used their horses in warfare. They didn't use their horses, for instance, to make mass charges or anything like that. And the standard infantry of Gaelic Ireland were cairns, who would have fought with a variety of weapons but would have worn no armour. I've already established that Ireland was made up of 150 smaller kingdoms, but we had some larger kingdoms. And if we look at the map, you'll see on screen, you have the Kingdom of Leinster in the southeast, the Kingdom of Meath, the Kingdom of Munster, Ossory, Connacht, Breffni, Argilla, and Ulad. And then we also have the Kingdom of the O'Neills, or the Northern O'Neills. Now, there is a southern branch of the O'Neill family which would cover the Kingdom of Meath, but the O'Neills are more associated with the north, and they're going to play a huge role in Irish history. Now, war amongst these rival kingdoms was very common and very regular, and the kingdoms of Leinster and Connacht are going to play a particularly important role when it comes to the Norman invasion, and Breffni too, to a degree. I mentioned this briefly in my previous lesson, but one of the most misunderstood concepts when it comes to Gaelic Ireland is the idea of a High King. And what exactly is a High King? Because most people, when they hear the term High King, they assume that it's a traditional monarchy where you have essentially a king of Ireland. But to be clear, a High King did not rule in a traditional sense the entire island. The High King is essentially the most dominant king, the strongest king on the island at that time, and they would receive tribute and recognition from the other kingdoms in recognition of the fact that they are the strongest king on the island. And in other words, militarily speaking, they would have the ability to defeat them in battle. And for centuries, the O'Neills, the Northern O'Neills, and the Southern O'Neills too, dominated the role. But Brian Boru, who we mentioned in our class on Viking Ireland, was one of the first to break that tradition. He came from Munster and established himself as one of the most powerful High Kings ever. Some sources even have him described Emperor of the Irish. But after the death of Brian Boru, another power would emerge, and that would be from the Kingdom of Connacht, with the O'Connors also dominating the High Kingship for much of the 12th century. So the O'Neill's dominance had been broken first by Brian Boru and later the O'Connors of Connacht. So let's explore each kingdom in a little bit more detail. So the Kingdom of Leinster in the 12th century AD encompasses a large area of southeast Ireland, and each of the Viking cities or towns like Dublin and Wexford and Waterford and Cork, each of these cities were like city-states. So they were ruled by Norse Gaelic kings, and they were largely independent of the surrounding kingdom. Now, very often they would have paid homage to the more powerful kingdoms surrounding them, but for all intents and purposes, they were independent. Dermot MacMurrough came to power as a teenager in the year 1126 AD, and his capital was Ferns. Now, Dermot constantly interfered with Dublin, and he also had a relationship with the Normans in terms of both trade and supplying Gaelic mercenaries to fight for the Anglo-Normans. So King Henry II would have had actual dealings with Dermot prior to 1166, and he would have actually hired a lot of Dermot's mercenaries, which is why Dermot seeks him out when things start to go wrong. Now, I do have a separate video series on Dermot MacMurrough, so please do check that out. Moving on to the Kingdom of Connacht. Connacht was one of the most powerful kingdoms on the island, and as I mentioned, the O'Connor family dominated both local and Irish politics for centuries, but particularly in the 12th century. Turlough O'Connor had one of the longest reigns, 1106 to 1156, and he would have been competing against the O'Neills of Ulster for that High Kingship. After Turlough's death, his son Rory would become King of Connacht and eventually High King of Ireland, and he would form a very strong alliance with the Kingdom of Breffni. Now, the Kingdom of Munster was dominated by the O'Brien family, and the O'Briens were descendants of the High King Brian Boru, who had been both King of Munster and High King of Ireland in 1002. He died in battle at the Battle of Clontarf, if you recall, in 1014, and competing against the O'Briens was a rival clan called the McCarthys. Now, the McCarthys and O'Briens were engaged in a very strong blood feud for many, many years. But in 1118, Turlough O'Connor, the King of Connacht, officially partitioned Munster into two kingdoms. The Kingdom of Thomond, which was northern Munster, which was led by the O'Briens, and Ormond, or southern Munster, which would be led by the McCarthys. This division is going to be important because the kingdoms of Thomond and Ormond play a very important part in the story of the Norman invasion of Ireland. Now, the north was divided into several kingdoms. We had Ulad, Argilla, and the O'Neill territories. And even within the O'Neill territories, there was a lot of smaller kingdoms. By the 12th century, the sons of Lachlan O'Neill began calling themselves MacLachlan, or Sons of Lachlan, and a bitter rivalry emerged between two factions of the same family, with the O'Neills and MacLachlans competing against each other to rule this land. Murtagh MacLachlan dominated the kingdom from 1136 to 1166, and he was that challenger to Rory O'Connor for the High Kingship of Ireland. King Dermot of Leinster was an ally of Murtagh. Tiernan O'Rourke of Breffni was an ally of Rory O'Connor. So there was this major alliance between several of the large kingdoms. So on one side you had Leinster and the Northern O'Neills, and then you had the kingdoms of Connacht and Breffni as another. So Murtagh MacLachlan being the challenger for the High Kingship on one side, Rory O'Connor on the other. Now, Murtagh died in an ambush in 1166, which left Rory O'Connor as the undisputed High King of Ireland. But Rory wasn't finished. So that completes a tour of Gaelic Ireland, and I hope you join me for our next lesson where we actually start the Norman invasion, or the first phase of the Norman invasion, the first part in the story. And from here on in, we're actually going to be going into a lot more detail. Everything up until this point has been placing pieces on the board, so to speak. But now we are starting to get into some of the key characters and the kingdoms that would have been in existence at the time of the Norman invasion. Please do follow or subscribe if you are enjoying the content. There's a lot more to come. And I thank you for listening and hope you can join me for the next time.